Friends, a very good evening and a warm welcome to the fourth of this year's Lent Lectures, as together we explore God at the ballot box, helping us reflect as Christians from across the churches of Salisbury about the sort of issues which we might like to be thinking about as we go towards the general election later in the year. Usual housekeeping stuff. If you have a mobile device and can just check now that it's on silent or switched off, that would be really useful. If during this evening you need the toilets, they are through in the cloisters. Just head through the south transept to the door which is there. And if you need anything this evening, then my colleagues who are with the white sashes as stewards are here to help you. The group of us who are reflecting on this series and what we might discuss and share together were mindful that one of the hot potatoes in British politics and across Europe and other parts of the world is immigration and refugees. And who better to talk to us about this tonight than John Proctor, representing the Roman Catholic Church, where he is Deacon over at St Osmond's and within the wider team, and as the founder of Salisbury over 30 years ago, providing vital services for so many of the needy and vulnerable in Salisbury, and then reaching out to the southwest and to Wales as well. It's a work with which John has been so involved for so many years, has been awarded the OBE for his services to charity for that. John, it's a huge honour to have you here tonight. Thank you for coming and sharing about immigration and refugees.
Thank you. First, may I apologise for the voice. At least I have a voice still tonight, but just about there. So, where does one start on this? I take it many of you will have seen the very popular TV programme, Would I Lie to You? I thought that would be a good place to start. My only second thought was that I didn't want to use profane language in such a holy place, but I'm afraid that that is where we're going to start. Brexit. Truth or lie? You'll remember the two main things that stand out for me for Brexit was the red bus. We will save £350 million a week to invest in the NHS. I'm not sure where the bus went, but we still haven't seen the money. And the other big thing was we will take back control of our borders. What did that actually mean? What I want to try and do tonight is give you just a little bit of background. There are some facts and figures in this to understand what we mean by migration and immigration. Because all we ever hear about are the boats. And it makes us think that, we're swamped in this country by all these illegal immigrants. And they are a very small part of the issue. So, let's look at what's happened in net migration. If we go back to 2015, 303,000 a year was the net migration figure in that year. Now, net migration is the difference between those who come into the country and those who leave the country. So the net is the increase, if you like, in our population in that year. 2019, before Brexit had happened, 184,000 people. That's the first line on your graph. The amazing thing is, taking back control of our borders, in 2022, after Brexit, net migration shot up to 745,000, falling back marginally in 2023 to 672,000. And I say that because I don't think people were really concerned about refugees when they were saying that they wanted us to take back our borders. They were complaining about all the people of different nationalities living around them. But they weren't here illegally. They all had freedom of travel. So let's look at who left the UK in that year of 2022, when 750,000 was the net increase. So there were 93,000 Brits left the UK. Perhaps we seem to forget that we Brits also emigrate and go to other countries. And let's hope we can be welcomed more than some of the people we might welcome here. There were 215,000 left of European Union citizens. And that was to be expected because they were told really they weren't welcome. That was why we were taking back control of our borders. Because in Europe, and being a member of the European Union, of course there was freedom of travel. And therefore by taking back control we could stop them coming. And there were also 200,000 non-EU citizens who left the country in that year. Now let's have a look at who does live in our country. So this graph is based, first of all, on the Polish population. Because the blue line in 2008, we had 500,000 Poles living in our country. By 2016, part of being in the European Union, that had grown to 1 million. And you will have seen many of them here in Salisbury. We had a very significant Polish population here at the time. And then 2021, after Brexit, a number of those went home. They knew that they had to apply if they wanted to stay here, and they had only come temporarily, really, while the Polish economy was so difficult. So by 2021, that number had fallen to 696,000. But of course, they're not the only people living in this country. So the blue line there shows that the Poles in 2021 were by far the greater. But running in line there, we have the Indian population, the Irish population, the Italian population, all between 340,000 and 370,000 each. Romanians, 340,000, Portuguese, 268,000, Spanish, 208,000, and Filipinos, 53,000. It was the Filipinos that surprised me, that they were so small, because I think here in Salisbury we see so many, because of course they've come for the hospital. So since 2021, 120,000 other people have come in. That's the second part in the diagram, 2022 there. They're the people from Hong Kong. You'll remember we opened our borders to those from Hong Kong because it was trying to be loyal to them, having given it back to China. And they came under the British national visa system. And then in 2023, we have, of course, Putin invading Ukraine, and we saw Ukrainians arriving. So the Ukrainians were a special situation. In 2022, 7 million citizens left the Ukraine, and 1.75 million returned, despite the war, in 2023. I think having realized the war was not going to be quick, and when we invited and opened our borders to them, I think we probably thought 6 months, and they'll be going back. So you remember the scheme that was put on offer was, would you open your home for 6 months to a Ukrainian family? And here in Salisbury we did, and people were very generous, and we had quite a lot of Ukrainians came here. On the 8th of January 2023, 210,000 people in total came from the Ukraine to the UK. What's important, though, is to say that that represented 1.9 per thousand of the UK population. Pretty insignificant, and so you could be excused if you never ever met one. 1.9. But let's just compare this with other European countries, because I just sense in all I hear across the media that we think we're badly done to in this country. We're a small island. Well, let's look at some others. Estonia and Czechia. 41.1 of their population per thousand are Ukrainians. In Poland, 36.1. Lithuania, small country, 23.2. Latvia, 20. Slovakia, 17. Germany, 12. And there we sit, the UK, shouting and complaining, 1.9 people per thousand. Now, if we were talking about percentages, you might have some arguments say, oh, well, we're a small country. But this is based per thousand of population. The difference between Estonia 41.1, and us at 1.9. Now, part of the reason for that, of course, is that these other countries border the Ukraine, and therefore they're staying as close to home as they can because they're wanting to go back. But we have a very small percentage. Let's move on to refugees. Now, these are refugees in one sense, but we tend to talk about refugees as if they're all asylum seekers. And so I want to try and identify the difference between people seeking asylum and people who are migrating for other reasons of better wealth, whatever. So in 2023, 93,000 people came as asylum seekers. They came mainly from Afghanistan, from Iran, from Albania, from India, and Iraq. They were the bulk of these people seeking asylum. So let's not forget the people from Hong Kong haven't really come seeking asylum. We've given them the open door to come. The people from Ukraine haven't come seeking asylum. They've come seeking a safe place while the war takes place. And if we look at where we rank in Europe in terms of asylum seekers, then per head of population, we're 20th in the league table. So we're certainly not there up at the top. The BBC have updated some of those figures to say in 2022 we had 46,000 asylum seekers arrived. In 2023, that had dropped to 29,500. So what's the definition of a refugee? Well, according to the 1951 United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees, it says, they are a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. Or who, not having a nationality and being outside of the country of his former habitual residence as a result of such events, is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it. And that is a definition accepted across the world at this time. So, a person seeking asylum is a person who's left their country of origin and formally applied for asylum in another country, but whose application has not yet been concluded. A migrant is referred as someone who's moved to another country for other reasons, such as to find work. So we had many migrants coming from the European Union to find work here when we were still in the European Union. And someone who's been refused asylum is a person whose application has been unsuccessful and who has no other claim for protection, awaiting a decision. "72% of refugees live in countries neighbouring their own country. At the end of 2022, Turkey was providing safety to 3.7 million Syrian refugees. They were the biggest host country in the world. By the end of February 21, the UK had resettled just over 20,000 refugees from Syria under the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme. I was involved as the coordinator for the Syrian refugees that came to Wiltshire, particularly to the area of Salisbury. And it was quite an eye-opener. These people came. We weren't asked to put them in our own homes. The council found them accommodation. And part of our job was to, one, help them with the language, which wasn't very easy because we didn't have the language, but I learned to use the phone to do that quite effectively for translation. But we were to help them open bank accounts, to register with a doctor, etc. And I'll just give you one illustration. The father of the family, one of the families I was looking after, had a heart problem. And he'd run out of medication, and so he rang me at 5:45 to say he'd run out of medication, he needed to see a doctor. So I said, oh gosh, that's a problem because surgeries close at 6. But I rang a surgery who said, if you can get here for 6, then we'll see him. Great. Very cooperative. We were in Ramadan, and he was Muslim. So of course he was in bed. So I rang him back and said, you've got 5 minutes to get out of bed, and I'll be outside the door and get you to the doctor. So we went to see the doctor. Doctor was fantastic, I have to say. Did telephone translation while they were having the interview and wrote him a prescription. I thought all was great. Fortunately, the pharmacy was in the surgery. So we went to the pharmacy and gave him the prescription, and the pharmacist said, I can't give you that because we don't stock that medication. We always use this. And I said, does that do the same thing? I said, well, give him that. No, we can't. We can only give what's on the prescription. So I ran out of the place, caught the doctor driving out of the car park, and said we need a different prescription. Doctor very kindly gave us the prescription, came back in, gave it to the pharmacist, and he said, so that'll cost you £32, I think it was. So I said, but this man is part of the Syrian refugee scheme. They're entitled to national health. What's his national insurance number? I said, he hasn't got that yet, he's only just arrived. Right. Well, you can reclaim it. Here's the form. 32 pages long. I lost all sense of control at that point and said, this is absolutely ridiculous. Thumped the desk, and the pharmacist said, who wasn't British, he said, well, sir, I could give you this other form, and I could partially complete it for you. I said, well, what's that form? Well, this is only 3 pages long. And I just took a deep breath, and I thought, yes, this is a Syrian refugee, but this is what the poor people of our country have to go through all the time. If you're on benefits, if you're not sure what you're entitled to, they're all going round in this circle, and it's appalling. And so having refugees here taught me a lot more empathy now for those who are struggling on the margins and have to use our welfare system. It is not easy to tackle. So the UK is home to approximately 1% of the 27.1 million refugees who were forcibly displaced across the world. 1%. Is that too much for a country of our standing to cope with? So, people seeking asylum. They're looking for a place of safety. 41% of displaced people across the world are indeed children. 41%. In 2021, more than 2/3 of the refugees across the world came from just 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, which the Cathedral, of course, has a strong link with the diocese, and Myanmar. Those 5 countries in 2021 were producing 2/3 of the refugees. The 1951 Refugee Convention guarantees that everybody has the right to apply for asylum. It has saved millions of lives, and it's interesting that no country has ever withdrawn from it, although we constantly say we're prepared to in the present climate. Since 2021, a new system was introduced by the Home Office, and it claims either classed or inadmissible. Claimants were claimed as either classed or inadmissible, meaning that the person could be removed to another country or issued with a notice of intent. So we either remove you or we give you a notice of intent. Between January 21 and September 23, nearly 70,000 had claims deemed potentially inadmissible. and 32,000 were issued with notices of intent. Now, not all those latter cases will have had a decision yet, but of those that have, only 83 were subsequently served with inadmissibility. 83 of the 32,000. Of these 23, of those 83, 23 were returned to a third country, mostly in Europe. And in 2023, there have been no inadmissibility decisions and only one removal. So in short, what we're saying is the people that are coming in, the vast majority are being accepted as good asylum cases and are getting their asylum claims settled here. 43,000 whose claim had been considered potentially inadmissible were subsequently admitted into the UK asylum process. So of those 70,000 initial deemed potentially inadmissible, 43,000 later were considered as potentially admissible. 75% of initial decisions made in the year to September 23 have been grants of protection. We said 41% of refugees are children. We have many unaccompanied children coming here, some as young as 14. And they're not all with parents. You know, the unaccompanied are coming on their own. They've journeyed across Europe, wherever, to get here. In the last 12 months, 4,656 children applied, accounting for 6% of the total asylum applications. These are not terrorists. These are not threats to our security. Of these claims decided in the last 12 months, 78% were granted asylum. I'll give you a case at the end of one we have here who hasn't been granted asylum at this stage. A further 112 unaccompanied children were granted short-term leave to remain, which expires after 2.5 years. So they tell them they can stay. They're really waiting for them to become an adult when they can then look to deport them. And you can imagine how insecure they feel during that time, because they just don't know what's going to happen to them 2.5 years down the line. And where do most of these people come from? They come from Afghanistan. They're the people that we said needed to be protected. So, what's the Christian response? Well, first of all, I've turned to Catholic social teaching. The Catholic Church has an enormous library of social teaching going back over many decades. But they approach this point from the point of view of human dignity rather than legal status or national interest. That comes way down the line. They say the first thing we have to do is look at the dignity of the person and what they're entitled to. It's not about defending sovereign territory, but rather how right our relationships are with self, with God, with others, and with creation. So how do we as individual Christians respond to people on the move? Teaching goes on to say anyone forced to move to preserve life or human dignity has a moral claim on the hospitality of others. And we've seen that with the Syrians, with the Ukrainians. We are now beginning perhaps to see the people from Afghanistan gradually being located here in Salisbury. The more vulnerable the person is, then the greater the claim they have. The protection of rights is beyond the cause of displacement, and transcendent dignity that must always be respected. People on the move should enjoy the full range of human rights, and we have a duty to see they are respected, protected, and fulfilled. And I remember with the Ukrainians, the Wiltshire Council really honouring that wherever they were placed in homes, they came to inspect, to check they were of a reasonable quality and that they were safe. They were honouring that. And it's interesting to know that Pope Francis, when he was appointed, became Pope, the very first visit he made was to Lampedusa. And he said to his staff, I want to go to Lampedusa. It was headlines of the news, remember the child that was found dead on the beach. Huge numbers being migrated into this tiny island, totally overrun. He wanted to be there in solidarity with them. And the Vatican said, we can't just do that. It takes months to arrange a visit. He said, you can't just go to another, He threw his arms up and he said, okay, let it be. And he went off and he telephoned himself the lifeboat institution over there. And they set it up for him. And within 4 weeks, he was there in Lampedusa. Wanted to be in solidarity with those people who were suffering so much. The Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church says, the more prosperous nations are obliged, to the extent they are able, to welcome the foreigner in search of security and the means of livelihood which they cannot find in their country of origin. And public authorities should see to it that the natural right is respected that places a guest under the protection of those who receive them. How do we reconcile this with our government's response today to deport all illegal immigrants to Rwanda and whilst awaiting deportation, hold them indefinitely in camps or on barges? And many people seem to be under the misjudgment that, well, that's fine because they go to Rwanda and then they can make their asylum claim. And if they're accepted, then they can come back. No. They go to Rwanda before anyone looks at anything. And yes, they can make a claim for asylum, but they make it in Rwanda, to stay in Rwanda, not to come back here. And there are lots of questions, I think, around that. What have the churches said? Well, regarding just that bill, the church has said, we are appalled by the proposals in the government's illegal migration bill to detain, punish, and reject thousands of people seeking safety. They are completely incompatible with our Christian conviction that all human beings are made in the image of God and are therefore inherently worthy of treatment, which honors their dignity. Instead of dignity, these plans will foster discrimination and distrust and cause immeasurable harm to people already made vulnerable by conflict and persecution. If ever there was a contemporary example of ignoring our neighbour and walking by on the other side, this is it. When 2 in 3 people who cross the Channel to seek sanctuary in the UK are granted asylum following rigorous checks, it seems unthinkable to reject them before they've even had a chance to have their claim for asylum heard. Many people fleeing war and persecution in countries such as Iraq, Iran, Syria, Eritrea, and Sudan have been left with no safe and accessible routes to claim asylum in the UK, forcing people to make these difficult and dangerous decisions. The UK falls far behind our global neighbours in welcoming people seeking sanctuary into our communities. And yet these plans essentially put a ban on claiming asylum and reject the UK's responsibility to play our part in responding to global inequalities and conflict. The Archbishop of Canterbury said, "It is morally unacceptable and politically impractical to let the poorest countries deal with the crisis alone and cut our international aid." That's what our church ministers and leaders are saying. But what does the Bible say? We can go to Exodus. "You shall not oppress a stranger, since you yourselves know the feelings of a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." Strangers are mentioned 36 times in the Torah. In the book of Leviticus, "When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God." In the New Testament, in Matthew's Gospel, one well known to all of us, I was hungry and you gave me food, thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And in the letter to the Hebrews, be sure to welcome the stranger into your home. By doing this, some people have welcomed angels as guests without even knowing it. When I read that last one for Hebrews, it really took me back to the start of Elaborate. And Elaborate started when my family took a homeless man of the road in to live with us. He was with us on and off for 2 years. It would be a far cry from saying he was an angel. But it changed my life. It changed my family's life. It changed our whole outlook on the homeless, who I really had a very poor opinion of at one stage. Not only that, but it now led to Elaborate, which houses over 2,000 people a year and has done for 30 odd years. And I think that's what Hebrews is telling us, how God works through the stranger that we welcome. So what can you do? What can I do? Well, we can reflect theologically, we can read the scripture passages and what the Bible suggests we should be doing, and we can pray. I am a firm believer in the power of prayer. I was very ill last year. My whole community, my parish prayed for me. The Cathedral prayed for me. I felt the power of that prayer. And I bore that with confidence as I went through. And I'm here today, healed and repaired, thank God. Learn and share the realities of migration. Bust the myths that the whole country is overrun with asylum seekers and refugees. It isn't true. Get to know a little bit more about this illegal migration bill. I come here to talk about this today. Little did I know that last week the House of Lords would defeat parts of that bill 10 times in the week and send it back to the House of Commons. But we know it will bounce back again, and they won't accept any of the objections. But the House of Lords clearly up in arms at the whole tenure of what we're about. And today there's been a podcast released by David Neal, I think the name is. David Neal was the independent Inspector of Immigration, Chief Inspector of Immigration and Borders. And he was independent, and so he's been sacked. Something like 20 of his reports hadn't been published, and they republished them once he was sacked and told people that. And if you listen to his report that he's now gone public with on this podcast, he says really, he doesn't use the word Home Office is unfit for purpose. He tells you lots of other things about it. And the people interviewing him said, so really what you're saying is it's unfit for purpose. He said, well, I can't say that, but that's for you to assess. But it's appalling. For all the fuss we're making, we have no control of our borders. We're letting people fly in on private aircraft and never even asking to see a passport. It's unbelievable. So if it's so important to us, why are we not looking at this in a more effective way? We can welcome and support people locally, and I know many have done that with the Syrian refugees and the Ukrainian refugees here in Salisbury, and I understand now that the Afghan refugees are being housed in some of the military property, but they're there with nothing, and so you'll hear, no doubt, very shortly appeals for help with clothing, furniture, etc. And we can advocate and campaign for the rights of asylum seekers and refugees. You have to be careful when you campaign and advocate. There's lots of people at the moment campaigning in London for the Palestinians who are refugees in their own land. And of course we're being told that actually these are all terrorists. It's unbelievable. So when you put your head above the parapet, you too will be attacked for what you're doing. You only need one or two people in a crowd to be very anti what's going on, that the whole thing gets distorted through the media. The Canterbury Diocese have done an interesting thing. They've launched a prayer bank. I'd never come across this before. And you can write your own prayer for a refugee and post it on their prayer bank. And refugees can go and read them as well. And some of them are so encouraging and upbuilding to let refugees, if you're hearing bad news, go onto this prayer bank, because there's some lovely warm prayers that are being offered for people. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says we could emulate the Kinder Transport to aid the refugee crisis. I don't know how many of you have seen One Life by Nicholas Winton. Nicholas Winton was the chap who went and brought the children from Czechoslovakia, the Jewish children, to escape from the Nazis. 669 children, he and a small team in Czechoslovakia managed to get out of the country and save their life. It was incredible. And those 669 children now form families numbering over 6,000 people in our country today. How those families have been made welcome and have grown. Ordinary people make a difference. Ordinary people like you and I can make an incredible difference by playing our part. And if you haven't seen One Life, it's well worth going to see. It's a lovely film. We saw it at the new cinema, the Everyman is it, sitting back on couches having supper. But it is a beautiful film. You could cry through it, but it's very well done. So, there are conventions and there are protocols. Most of those establishing legal rights for refugees emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War, as did the Declaration of Human Rights. And we British people were the people who were leading it. The same people now want to withdraw from it. We were the people who actually said how important this was. Today, Rishi Sunak tells us migrants could destabilise and overwhelm our country. The messages of fear, boats and gangs. And he isn't alone in what he's saying. Lee Anderson, the deputy chair of the Conservative Party, who's just been defrocked because he made accusations against the Mayor of London being controlled by Islamists. He's just announced today he's now the first MP in Parliament for the Reform Party. It's amazing how no one's ever elected him to represent the Reform Party. He's now joined us and he's their first MP. And listening to his introduction as to why, it's quite frightening, really. But Joe Biden has a different perspective. He says, welcoming refugees is part of who we are. Our nation was founded on those fleeing religious persecution. When we take action to help refugees around the world and include them, we honour the past and are stronger for it. So, I want to finish really by saying Elaborate have unaccompanied asylum seekers in our care, 12 or 13 at the moment in the properties we have. We have 5 in Salisbury. They were all under 18 when they came to us. Most of them were about 16. They're from Albania, Iran, and Sudan at the moment. One young man who I was talking to this week comes from Albania. He left home at the age of 16 to escape from feuding families that made it unsafe for him to stay, and his family told him to leave. He travelled by bus right across Europe until he reached France. And when he got to France, he travelled across the channel in one of these boats, fearing for his life, and was picked up in the channel by the Home Office Border Force and brought to shore. I said to him, why didn't you stay in France or anywhere else you travel through? And he said, well, very simply, he said, I was too afraid. He said, because of the open borders and freedom of travel in Europe, the people who were after me in Albania could follow me and get me, and that would be the end of my life. He said, but I know they can't travel into England. So I wanted to be in England for my safety. So he said, being in a strange country, he had no English language at all. He felt quite stressed. But being underage, he was placed in a hotel with unaccompanied minors in Folkestone. For the first 2 weeks, he was not allowed to leave the hotel. He said the day would start, we had to be up by 9 o'clock, tidy our room, and go downstairs for breakfast. And then we were given computer games to play on for the rest of the day and fed at mealtimes. After 2 weeks, he said, we were allowed to leave the hotel with security, either to play football or go swimming. The Home Office then moved him to a library in Salisbury, and he wanted to go to college. But he had to wait a year before he could start college because the Home Office had to provide him with proof of ID, and that took a year. He's been in the UK 18 months. He's now 18 years of age. He has a national insurance number, and he's had his asylum claim rejected. But he's now lodged an appeal because he says, the fact that there isn't a war in Albania is not why I'm here. It's because of the feud that was going on, and for my safety, I had to leave the country. So he's appealing it. And whilst this goes on, he says, his solicitor tells him he can work now. And I said, well, that's wonderful because we've got 1 million vacancies in this country and asylum seekers are not allowed to work. He says, my sister tells me I can now work, but no employer will touch me because I need a share code, he says, and I won't receive this until I get my asylum approved. So the legal's saying one thing to him, but in practice it's just not possible. How can we have 1 million vacancies in our country? We've sent the Europeans back into Europe, and now we can't run the services. Can you imagine if we didn't have the Indians and the Filipinos, the Africans now coming over to run our hospitals? None of us would be here today. If you've had any illness, without those, the hospital would dry up. And so he continues to study at college. His English is improving all the time. He's a lovely young man. He's polite. He's keen to develop skills, and he wants to work. But at the moment, he lives from day to day with the uncertainty that he could be returned to Albania, where he would not be safe. Albania is one of the countries where we already have arrangements just to send people back. So adults would automatically be returned to Albania. It is a complex problem. It's not one that you and I can solve overnight. All we can hope, I think, as Christians, is to challenge our MPs to respect the dignity and the humanity of those in our care. And for the people who are coming across by boats now and are being put into camps, onto barges, including children, in the chap today doing the podcast says, the camp at Manston, he said, when I went to inspect that, he said, it is worse than the treatment we were giving to the prisoners we had in Afghanistan who we'd captured for killing British soldiers. The conditions are worse. And for the children, he said, they're appalling. And we feed children with food which is outside their culture, so they won't eat it, and so they're losing weight. People say, oh, you're giving them food. He said, well, that's not treating them with dignity. It's not food that they know, not food that they can eat. You try getting your children just to eat vegetables, your grandchildren. It's a challenge. If it's not what they're used to, they won't touch it until they get so bad that they're starving. So I don't have the answers, but I do know we need to challenge, and we shouldn't just accept the things we're being told. We have to try and bust the myths that are out there that these people are dangerous. That's not to say nobody is dangerous. Clearly there will be a protection. But as the independent inspector of immigration and border control said, we're letting them walk through without even checking them in some places. So why are we victimizing these people who are genuine refugees? I'm going to leave it there, and I'll try and deal with any questions you might have. Thank you.